The whispering shadows of Blackwater Hollow. Nestled deep within the rugged mountains, far from the bustling cities and modern life, lay the forgotten town of Blackwater Hollow. Once a thriving mining community, it was now a ghost town, its wooden structures crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. The mines that had once brought fortune and hope now stood as gaping maws into the earth, their depths shrouded in darkness. Few dared to visit Blackwater Hollow. Those who did spoke of an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint whispers that seemed to echo through the empty streets. Locals claimed the town was cursed, haunted by the souls of miners who had perished in a tragic collapse decades ago. But for Emma, a curious historian with a fascination for the past, the stories only fueled her desire to uncover the truth. One crisp autumn morning, Emma arrived at the outskirts of Blackwater Hollow. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, and the sun cast long shadows over the dilapidated buildings. Armed with her camera, notebook, and a flashlight, she ventured into the heart of the town. The wooden planks of the old saloon creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside, the scent of decay filling her nostrils. As she explored, Emma noticed strange details. A child's doll lying in the dust, its glassy eyes staring blankly. A rusted pocket watch frozen at 11:59, and faint handprints on the walls, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The whispers grew louder, though she couldn't make out the words. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Drawn to the entrance of the abandoned mine, Emma felt an inexplicable pull, as if the darkness itself was calling to her. She hesitated, her flashlight flickering, but her curiosity won out. The mine was cold and damp, the walls glistening with moisture. As she ventured deeper, the whispers became clearer, forming words. "Leave, while you still can." Suddenly, her flashlight died, plunging her into complete darkness. Panic set in as she fumbled for her phone, its weak light barely illuminating the tunnel. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Shadows moved on the walls, twisting and contorting into human-like shapes. Emma turned to flee, but the tunnel seemed endless, the exit nowhere in sight. Then, she saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They were the miners, their spirits trapped in the mine, forever reliving their final moments. One reached out to her, his voice a mournful echo. "Join us. There is no escape." Emma screamed and ran, her heart pounding as the shadows closed in around her. Just as she felt icy fingers brush her arm, she burst into the sunlight, collapsing onto the ground. Gasping for breath, she looked back at the mine entrance, but it was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. She never returned to Blackwater Hollow. Though she tried to forget, the whispers followed her, creeping into her dreams and waking hours. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear the faint ticking of a pocket watch, frozen at 11:59, a reminder that some places and some souls are better left undisturbed. The phantom station of Ashgrove. On the edge of a dense, mist-shrouded forest stood Ashgrove Station, a relic of a bygone era. Once a bustling hub for travelers and freight, it had been abandoned for over half a century after a tragic accident claimed the lives of dozens of passengers. The station was now a crumbling ruin, its platforms overgrown with weeds and its tracks rusted and broken. Locals avoided the area, claiming that on foggy nights, the sound of a train whistle could be heard echoing through the trees, though no train had passed through Ashgrove in decades. For Jack, an urban explorer with a passion for forgotten places, Ashgrove Station was the ultimate challenge. He had heard the stories of ghostly figures seen wandering the platforms, of phantom trains that vanished into the mist, and of a station master who never left his post. But Jack was a skeptic, and he was determined to prove that the tales were nothing more than superstition. One chilly evening, Jack arrived at Ashgrove Station, his camera and flashlight in hand. The fog was thick, reducing the world to a hazy gray. The station loomed ahead, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. As he stepped onto the platform, the silence was broken by the distant sound of a train whistle, mournful and haunting. Jack shook off the unease and began exploring. The ticket booth was still intact, its glass cracked and dusty. Inside, he found an old ledger, its pages filled with names and dates, all from the day of the accident. The ink was faded, but the final entry sent a chill down his spine. Last train delayed. Souls aboard. As he ventured further, Jack noticed strange details. A suitcase lying open on the platform, its contents spilling out. A child's toy train, rusted and broken, and a pair of spectacles resting on a bench, as if someone had just set them down. The fog seemed to grow thicker, and the air grew colder. The train whistle sounded again, closer this time. Suddenly, the platform lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the station. Jack froze as the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned to see a figure in an old-fashioned stationmaster's uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. The figure pointed to the tracks, where a ghostly train had materialized, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. The stationmaster's voice was a raspy whisper. "The last train is here. All aboard." Panic surged through Jack as the train's doors opened, revealing shadowy figures inside. They beckoned to him, their faces twisted in sorrow. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding, but the stationmaster blocked his path. "You cannot leave. The train must depart." Summoning all his courage, Jack bolted, sprinting down the platform and into the forest. The train whistle wailed behind him, and the lights of the station flickered wildly. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he looked back, Ashgrove Station was silent and dark once more, the fog swallowing it whole. Jack never spoke of what he saw that night, but he never returned to Ashgrove. And though he tried to convince himself it was all in his mind, he could never shake the feeling that the stationmaster was still waiting, his ghostly train ready to carry away anyone who dared to visit. To this day, on foggy nights, the sound of a train whistle echoes through the forest, a reminder that some places are never truly abandoned. The beacon of lost souls. Perched on the edge of a jagged cliff, overlooking a tumultuous sea, stood the Blackthorn Lighthouse. Once a guiding light for ships navigating the treacherous waters, it had been abandoned for decades after its keeper vanished under mysterious circumstances. Locals claimed the lighthouse was cursed, its beam now a beacon for lost souls rather than living sailors. They spoke of ghostly figures seen in the tower's windows and mournful cries carried on the wind during storms. For Clara, a marine biologist researching coastal erosion, the lighthouse was the perfect base for her work. She had rented a small cottage nearby and spent her days studying the shoreline. But the lighthouse fascinated her. Its towering structure, its history, and the eerie stories surrounding it. One stormy evening, curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to explore the abandoned tower. The wind howled as Clara approached the lighthouse, rain lashing against her face. The door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of salt and mildew. She flicked on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as she climbed the spiral staircase. The walls were lined with faded photographs of ships and sailors, their faces blurred by time. On the second floor, she found the keeper's living quarters. A small room with a rusted bed, a broken chair, and a desk covered in yellowed papers. Among them was a journal, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. The final entry read, "The light calls to them. They come from the sea, and they will not leave. I cannot escape." Clara's unease grew as she continued her ascent. The higher she climbed, the colder it became, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. When she reached the lantern room at the top, she was met with an astonishing sight. The lighthouse's beam was lit, casting a ghostly glow across the stormy sea. But the light was not coming from the bulb. It emanated from a swirling, ethereal mist that filled the room. Suddenly, the beam shifted, pointing directly at her. Clara shielded her eyes as the mist began to take shape, forming the figures of sailors in tattered uniforms. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their voices echoed in a mournful chorus. "Join us! The sea claims all." Terrified, Clara stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance on the narrow staircase. The sailors reached out to her, their hands cold and skeletal. She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing through the lighthouse as the beam followed her, illuminating the walls with its ghostly light. The wind outside roared like a living thing, and the cries of the lost souls grew louder. When she finally burst through the door and into the storm, the lighthouse fell silent behind her. The beam vanished, and the tower stood dark and lifeless once more. Clara returned to her cottage, drenched and shaken, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something about the lighthouse called to her, its pull growing stronger with each passing day. Weeks later, during another storm, Clara vanished. Her research equipment was found in the lighthouse, along with her journal. The final entry mirrored that of the long-lost keeper. "The light calls to them. They come from the sea, and they will not leave. I cannot escape." To this day, the Blackthorn Lighthouse remains abandoned, its beam dark and silent. But on stormy nights, locals claim to see a ghostly light shining from the tower, guiding lost souls to their final rest. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear the mournful cries of those who were never able to leave.